Welcome to Public Safety Talk Radio, the podcast for all of our heroes in public safety, including law enforcement professionals, firefighters, EMTs, corrections officers, healthcare workers, and more. The show is proud to be a part of the growing National Police Podcast Network. This episode is sponsored by Police Mortgage. Police Mortgage is a full-service mortgage company dedicated to serving police officers and first responders. Founded in 2008, Police Mortgage offers a variety of mortgage products tailored to meet the needs of those who serve and protect. Police Mortgage, for first responders who are second to none. I am Ken Bader, your host for Public Safety Talk Radio, and this is a first here on Public Safety Talk Radio. We've certainly had return guests. We've certainly had guests that have given us so much great content, like the recent episode with Arthur Mogilevsky, that we had to break it up into 2 episodes. But this is the first time ever I brought a guest back, not only in the same season, but in the same year, almost practically the same month. I'm bringing back Diane Braun from Braun Counseling Services, LLC. As I mentioned in the episode a few weeks ago, she's got a number of acronyms behind her name there, but I hear you have a new one related specifically to helping first responders. Why don't you tell us about that, Diane?
Well, I just recently, before the end of January, that's why I wasn't able to book in with you earlier this until now, is because I was working on getting my certification as being a nationally culturally competent therapist for first responders and public safety.
That is awesome, as we talked about before, and I've talked with other experts like yourself. There are a lot of great psychiatrists, therapists, and other people offering professional assistance, but I truly believe that there's a whole nother level in working with first
Yeah.
responders. As you know, you and I think, have joked before, and some other people, it's like, police officer or firefighter goes to a regular therapist, like, my therapist fired me because I triggered him.
Yeah. Or I broke another therapist, I sent him off in the corner crying. I'm like, come on, let's see if you can.
There you go. I like you're all up for it. Well,
Yeah.
we're main reason I brought you back is I wanted to dig into an unfortunate subject that I think we need to dig into that we haven't really covered with a lot of great clarity on public safety talk radio, and that's domestic violence. And shame on me, maybe it's because, I think first responders, are so, up here in terms of their level, but I know that they both, are perpetrators of domestic violence, unfortunately, for a lot of reasons. And as we talked about very briefly in the last show, they are victims of domestic violence. And, I didn't want to just give that a couple of minutes. I wanted to dedicate a whole episode on it. And you're an expert on domestic violence and helping people out of that, helping people recover, whether they're perpetrating it or a victim of it. So let's dig into that a little bit. And I think, too, maybe for my own edification, since I've obviously been a little naive in not covering it, how common is domestic violence in first responder families?
A little bit of research that I've looked at, it's about 20 to 30% more common than an
Mm,
average. And but anyhow, regardless, in average, there's about 30% of, individuals, whether, 30% women, about 10, 15% men who at some time in their life have been a victim of domestic violence from an intimate partner. And domestic violence is not just physical. That's
mm,
one of the biggest things that's why we don't really think about it. It's like, well, they didn't hit anybody, right? They didn't
right.
do all this stuff. But domestic violence focuses so much more. It looks at that intimidation. Is there use of intimidation, that emotional piece? Is that the victim being isolated? And sometimes it can catch it, it creeps up and you don't even realize it's happening. It doesn't matter
Hmm.
how intelligent you are, you can end up being a victim or a perpetrator because it kind of just happens and we just don't notice it happening, especially as a victim.
Yeah. Yeah, here's an interesting question. What's just is there truly a difference between, true domestic violence, even the non-physical part, and just a bad marriage or a bad relationship? Well, for instance, I'm on my second marriage, and
Okay.
I certainly wouldn't say that my first marriage, although less than enjoyable for me, was had any domestic violence in it from me or from her.
Mm.
But I will say, for a large portion, I was unhappy.
Right.
And part of that unhappiness was, for whatever reason, maybe it was because of me. I can own certainly some of that is, I never knew, I'm walking on eggshells. I never knew, what's going to set off, my ex-wife now, my wife at the time. What am I going to do now or say, that I think is innocuous that's going to piss her off and is going to ruin the next 3 days? So that's kind of what I dealt with. I certainly wouldn't label that as domestic violence, but going back to my original question, what's really the difference between just a bad marriage or bad relationship and true domestic violence?
Well, you got to look at one of the best ways to kind of look at things is one, get a, Google a copy of the Power and Control Wheel.
Hmm.
Because if you look at the domestic violence power and control wheel, it has on there, this has been developed from decades and decades ago. It talks about using coercion and threats, and it gives some examples, um, like making or carrying out threats to do harm, to hurt that person, threatening to leave them. Um, oh, I'm gonna harm myself if you don't do this, or if you do this, using their welfare, like you're not doing things right, so I'm going to call you in. Those
Hmm.
kind of coercions and threats. If you're receiving those, intimidation, whether it's smashing property, destroying property, uh, displaying weapons. Now we know when first responders, a lot of first responders are very, myself, I love my weapons.
Hmm.
I think I've told you before, me and my husband agree. He will never tell me how many shoes I can buy, and I will never tell him how many guns he can buy, right?
I didn't hear. I
But
don't remember that one, but that is a
okay,
good. That's a good
right,
quid pro quo, by the way. But continue.
right, because he can't wear my shoes, but
Hmm.
I can always use those guns.
Right.
So, who was a smart one on that?
And now a word from our sponsor, Police Mortgage.
As a first responder, control matters on the job and at home. When it comes to buying or refinancing a house, Police Mortgage works specifically with first responders who want clear options, real guidance, and competitive rates. No confusion, no pressure, just experts who understand your world. Learn more at policemortgage.com or call 312 499 8878. Police Mortgage, for first responders who are second to none.
And learn more about Police Mortgage from their podcast, The Mortgage Beat, another podcast in the National Police Podcast Network.
We could use that intimidation where we're displaying weapons differently. And we know, if you've been around first responders, there's a difference between doing cleaning weapons, shooting, and hanging out with
Hmm.
the guys to how it's intimidation. Using that emotional abuse, making a person feel bad about who they are, playing
Hmm.
those mind games, humiliating them, making them feel guilty. And it can go, either way, where, well, if you really loved your family, you wouldn't be taking on those extra shifts versus, or if you really love me, you wouldn't be spending all this money or
Right.
anything. It's just those psychological mind games, isolating a person. And perpetrator of a responder may say, that first responder may say, well, I'm trying to keep you safe because there's all
Hmm.
these bad people. But are they really trying to keep you safe, or are they isolating you? So you have
Hmm.
to kind of look at it, because in the beginning, I would have believed it. Well, you don't know what it's like to be married to a first responder. This is what we have to do.
Hmm.
And if you haven't done your research and you don't have any support, you're going to believe it.
Yeah.
And, um, and so they control that, minimizing to blaming. Oh, you're making things up. That's not that how it was, or that was because of you. I wouldn't have done this. Using the children. I'll
Hmm.
take the children away. Um, and there's the old one, male privilege. because I'm the male, I said so. And then financial abuse, where one person only controls the checkbook and doesn't let the other person know, or doesn't let the other person obtain income.
Mhm.
You have to look at that. Does one of those things mean that you're in an abusive situation? It depends on how extreme. It's all kind of on a
Yeah.
continuum. So how intense, how frequent. Uh, my husband maybe at, when he knows that I want to go shopping, may kind of hide things, but I don't think that's necessarily abuse or,
Yeah.
but it's just like maybe trying to protect me. But I mean, you've got to be mindful of the intensity and know that it just kind of, we get groomed. And I say we
Mhm.
because I've been a victim of domestic violence in more than just one relationship. One of them was even a marriage, not
Mhm.
current. My husband that I have now is amazing. He,
Awesome,
he,
because you could buy all the shoes you want. Now, why wouldn't you
oh
be
yeah. Oh yeah. I mean,
happy?
he is just so sweet to me. But I mean, the thing is that you have to be mindful and just know that it can happen. I know we make light of you and I are kind of joking here,
Mhm.
but it is a very tough subject. And I think sometimes we have to bring some laughter or some, comic relief to this because it's a painful and it's a difficult situation to talk about.
Yeah, yeah. One phrase used to use a lot, and I haven't used in a while. I should probably bring it back to this show. Is making light of a very heavy situation doesn't necessarily mean that you're taking the situation lightly.
Oh, I like that. Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. And that
feel
is
free to
it.
use that. Yeah, another bonus for coming on Public Safety Talk Radio.
Wow. I'm impressed. But yeah, so I mean, you just have to be mindful. I didn't realize that I was being isolated because I was married to a military person that was active duty. We were out of state, and I would, back when we only had regular phones, no cell phones.
Hmm.
How old this was, and they're like, oh, I
I
get,
remember that. I
yeah,
remember when you just had those damn dials instead of
and you messed up and you had to hang up and start over
yeah.
again.
Yeah, I
Oh my
remember how
gosh,
excited we were when we could actually have the little buttons instead of,
buttons,
you have
yes.
dialing six numbers. Millennials and the Gen Zs won't understand this, but you used to have this stupid thing called a dial, and
Rotary dial.
yeah, and normally what you would do is you would get six freaking numbers into it,
Oh
and then
yeah,
yeah, and then you'd screw up on the seventh, son of a bitch, and then you got to start all
start
over
all
with this
over.
process. God forbid you actually had to put in an area code too.
Oh my God. And then or one or the number one, because if
Hmm.
you're calling long distance. Anyhow, oh, I love how we digress. But my mom would call. This is what I get told. I would come home from work. My spouse would tell me, "Oh, your mom called," and I said, "Oh, I'll give her a call back." And it was like, "Oh no, she said she'll call you later." And I was like, "Okay, but that wasn't what was going on.
Hmm.
It was my mom was calling, wanted me to call. I never called back because that's not what I was told." And that's a
Hmm.
form of isolation.
Hmm.
And it can be so simple that you don't see it. A lot of what I experienced, I did not see because it wasn't the physical, it
Hmm.
wasn't the sexual abuse. And
Right.
that's something else too, is that I had someone tell me, well, I wasn't raped because it was my husband, right? I was like,
Yeah.
did you want that to happen? Did you say no? Did you give consent? And it was not consensual. So it was rape. And people don't realize that that can happen.
Yeah. Yeah, highly unfortunate.
It is.
You mentioned a little bit about your experience in with a husband that was in the military.
Yeah.
As you work with first responders, yeah, and I say this in other veins, sometimes with workout programs and mental health and professions and so forth, that there's differences. We kind of lump all first responders sometimes or all public safety professionals, but there's a lot of different jobs out there. Even say being a 911 operator, is much different from being an EMT. It doesn't mean that their one job is lesser or one is dealing with more trauma than another.
Right.
I mean, if you're listening to somebody get knifed on the phone, it's just as traumatic as seeing the knife victim laying there as an EMT, coming to give them aid, So,
Right.
yeah, when it comes to domestic violence, is there differences in types of domestic violence, or you see more, I hate to call out police officers, but just as an example, do you see more domestic violence in police families versus an EMT family or a firefighter family? What are you seeing out there in terms of the differences as it relates to the professions and the families?
For me right now, what I haven't seen, like my numbers haven't been skewed one way or the other. It's either there or it's not. And I've, I've worked with it in all programs. I'm not seeing like it is primary law enforcement or dispatch or
Mhm.
corrections. It just it is, and they happen to be doing that job.
Mhm.
Because not everyone that I'm working with that are first responders that are involved with domestic violence is the actual perpetrator. I have,
Yeah.
several that have been the victims of it as well.
Yeah, yeah, and I think it goes to, you would know better than I would. It has to do with the individual and how you're dealing with stress.
Right.
So somebody could be a dispatcher and have months and months and months and months and months of normal, if you can call them normal calls, and then have
They're
one,
normal.
really, yeah, have it they're normal, and then have one really really bad day that changes, her or him instantly. Whereas, say a police officer could be, working in the roughest neighborhood of Omaha, for instance, and see a ton and not bring it home to their family at all and have a great family life. So you
Right.
really don't know. It's not just the job, it's what's going on in the individual's head.
Right. It's a lot of it's about being out of control, and the only way that they're able to control themselves is by controlling others,
Hmm.
if that makes sense. So I
Yeah.
mean, it's because most of the time what I've found with perpetrators, they will perpetrate on their victims in the quiet, behind closed doors in the dark
Hmm.
where no one else knows or sees, right?
Right.
They're only perpetrating on who they think that they can get away with it on. So they're not doing it to their coworkers, they're not doing it to a supervisor, they're not doing it at work. So that tells me that you're in control. If
Hmm.
you're able to control it when it happens and to who specifically it was, it's not it's not like you're out of control, but
Hmm.
you're being out of control internally, and you're lashing out and you're taking advantage of who you think is weaker than you that you can manipulate, if that makes any sense.
No, it makes a lot of sense, and hell, if I can understand it, almost everybody can understand it. Yes. So you made a great point just a few minutes ago, and on the last show that I had the privilege of having you on, is that it's not always the first responder. I mean, I think that among some, there's, I don't want to say common, but it's not a hard stretch to think, okay, a police officer, a male police officer has a rough job, and then he comes home and takes it out on his family, and it may escalate to domestic violence. I think that is what a lot of people think of first,
Mhm.
and certainly there is some of that out there without
Yeah.
question. But you also mentioned that isn't always the case. Sometimes, somebody's a police officer, sometimes even a male firefighter, and gets into a really bad marriage and has a wife
Mhm.
that's, hitting him with pots and pans and saying, I'm going to hit myself and say, you did this to me, and guess what's going to happen to your job as a firefighter? Tell us a
Yeah.
little bit about what you're seeing on both sides of the coin.
Well, what I'm seeing a lot, well, I shouldn't say a lot. What I have been seeing recently is where I've had, my first responder is the victim and the perpetrator is the spouse, and they're, recording the phone or recording with their phone after they've
Mhm.
spun everything up and they've said things and then they record. Great thing about editing, right, is that we know how to edit certain things and make it sound so we can catch just the right catchphrase.
Right.
And without having the full story. And we've seen that, the news does it a lot. They love doing that, right? Uh, where you just get to see that one piece. But the spouse is doing that. And I've had to explain to my client, you need to make sure that you are able to record the whole picture,
Right.
that, um, you're taking care of you, because they will use that against you. They will say, I've seen it where I'll ruin your career if you don't let this continue to happen. Or
Mhm.
I've had clients that just, they love their spouse, and the spouse has normally got some great things going on. If they were a bad person in the very beginning, more than likely when we would never have picked them.
Right.
But having that protection and seeing that that job can be used either as a detriment, they'll use it as ammunition, um, or I mean, first responders say, well, my guy's in blue, gold, red, whatever color. They're not going to believe you. They're my family. They're not going to believe you on what you
Mhm.
say. So go ahead, call them. They won't care. Or they might say it could be the other way around. I'm going to call them. I'm going to get you to lose their job because I'm going to go to this. I'm going to go do that. And a lot of times we'll jump to conclusions before we get the full story. I know it's
Mhm.
rare,
Go
but
figure. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Never happens on CNN or NBC or
right, where they say,
yeah.
"Oh my gosh, this is what happened." Let's before we say anything, we're going to check this out to make sure we've got our facts straight. But with domestic violence, though, we kind of do need to err on the side of caution, because we're talking, we need to make sure that we're protecting those that need to be protected. So I mean, it's just a tough line. And then we've had individuals that have used the system inappropriately. We've had
Mhm.
individuals that at the moment use the system when they needed to, but for one reason or another got scared or backed down. And then you get, the justice system going, "Ugh, I'm so tired of XYZ calling. They always call it, no big deal." And we know also that domestic violence are one of the most scariest calls for first responders to go on.
Sure. Sure, emotions are high, and I've
Mhm.
I've talked to many police officers, and they said, "Give me an armed robbery at a 7-Eleven
Yeah,
any day." I know what they're trying to do. It's very straightforward. When I
yes.
go into a domestic situation, I don't know what to expect. A knife coming out of nowhere. Somebody going from 0 to 60 in a second, and so forth.
Or you'll see them take down the perpetrator, and then the victim comes and says, "Stop hurting this person. Don't do that to them." Because
Hmm.
yeah, and it's conditioned. It's not that anybody should say, "What's wrong with these um, individuals? Why don't they just leave?"
Hmm.
Because it's not that easy. It's kind of like telling an alcoholic or an addict, "Why don't you just stop using?" Telling someone that's overweight, "Stop eating so much, exercise." Gee, if it was that easy, I wouldn't have a job, at least not doing this. And
Why would Go
I'd be
ahead.
okay with that, but that's not the case.
Yeah. Oh, as a alcoholic in recovery, I wouldn't know about that. You just stop,
Stop it.
Yeah, that's a great segue. You and I are on the same page because I wanted to segue into choices. Going back to the beginning of our conversation, even though there's clearly a difference between just a bad relationship and true domestic violence, there are people that stay in bad relationships, even though it's bad for them, even though
Mhm.
they're not getting psychologically or verbally or physically abused. They're still in a bad situation, and
Right.
they choose to stay for a lot of reasons. I mean, I will use myself as an example. I don't believe that I was a victim of domestic violence in any way, but I guarantee you, I stayed, probably 8 years, maybe 10 in that marriage longer than I really wanted to. And you think of, well, maybe things will change. Maybe let's go to counseling. Let's work on this. Do I really want to sell my house? Do I really want to do that? Do I
Mhm.
really want to start over? It's so many things like that. And I've seen, friends of ours that have done the same thing, stayed in relationship 3 years longer, when they were already unhappy. It's like, and then they want
Right.
to bitch. It's like, well, you're unhappy, but you're staying in there. So anyhow, my point, rather than going off on a rambling tangent like I often like to do, is everybody has choices, and I think that there's two sides of the coin to that. One, you make a choice. I made a choice to stay until I eventually made the choice to leave. And also, as an outsider looking in, there are factors. I didn't have any kids. That wasn't a factor. Sometimes that's a big factor. Sometimes it's even pets.
Oh, yes.
Purina has a great commercial out there, about, battered women and not wanting to leave because they don't want to leave their pets behind. And they said, we've got homes for you and so forth. But anyhow, there are a
Yeah,
number of
because that's
factors
where it
involved.
starts even.
Yeah.
There you'll see where the perpetrator will start with the animals.
Mm,
And they'll use that. If you leave me, I'll kill the dog or I'll kill the cat or I'll do this. And yeah, but it's difficult to know if you need to leave or if you should leave, or even if you know that you need to leave is hard.
mm,
Uh, I think when I was actively working as a domestic violence advocate for a domestic violence agency, the statistics at that time were it's like 1 out of every 7. It takes like over 7 times to leave before
mm,
you'll actually stay gone. And so you think about that. How many, you know, that's a lot of times. And that's one of the most dangerous times of a relationship because the perpetrator then says, I don't have control over that person.
mm,
And so then they're going to use all different other ways to try to get back control, whether it's being super nice and sweet or being really violent or anything in between. They're going to try to change it up and so they can get control again. And so that makes it very lethal for a victim to leave. And you can't always do it because if there's that financial obligation, you know, they don't have access to money, they don't have anywhere to go. I had a individual that I worked with who came from a very affluent life. They had
mm,
lots of money. They had zero control over their money. The perpetrator did. And so when they went to go to a shelter for help, they said, well, you have all this money. I said, but I don't have
mm,
access to it. And there's like, well, I'm sorry, we can't help you.
mm.
Yeah. So
Yeah,
it's,
that's unfortunate.
and knowing when to do it and how to do it and how to stay safe the best way you can is, can be very difficult.
So what do you do? Yeah, I think that's the golden question. I know there's
Yeah.
no silver bullet, and as we just kind of went through, there's a lot of choices, there's a lot of factors involved.
Right.
It's disappointing for me to hear, somebody was a victim of domestic violence, and because jointly there were all these assets that individual at the time couldn't get help. That's unfortunate.
Yeah.
And then the lack of understanding of the situation. But so if somebody's watching, listening, and they're hearing this and says, yeah, I've been a victim for a while. I need to find a way to get out of this. What are 2 or 3 tips to get started on that road?
First thing I would tell them to do is to reach out to their local domestic violence center if they
Hmm.
can. If not, they can always reach out to the National Domestic Violence Hotline. They can either call or text. Um, and the National Domestic Violence Hotline number is the 800-799-7233. And then if you text START, START, to 88788, you can get help that way. But you need to be mindful. Nowadays, technology is a blessing, but it's also a curse
Right.
because um, individuals share passwords or have access you know, to get into your information. So you need to be mindful of that. there are lots of ways to safety plan. And the thing is that it's not the ideal way for an individual may not be immediately just run and go. In other cases, it may be. If you do have law enforcement called in and you don't feel safe, keep asking for help. Ask for help. Hopefully, our first responders know that if there's that situation, and I've seen it so many times in a good way where the officers will separate the people where they can't see or hear the other person and ensure that they're safe. And um, if you've been in a domestic violence relationship, because just like how one addicted person knows another addicted person, you just have that immediate connection, and just do whatever you can for help. Know that they may not be ready, and don't force anybody to leave if they're not ready. Oh, I mean, you just have to, it can be frustrating. It's like you keep calling me and asking me for help and then you don't do it. But that's part of that perpetrator's plan, is to get it to where no one will help you, but keep asking for help. Know that people will believe you. You just have to find the right people. One of the things I wish I would have done, but I wish I would have done looking back at it, but knowing now that I didn't, I'm okay because I'm here with it. What my ex was in the active duty military. I could have called command and something could have been done, but I was scared to death because I was told, you do this, we'll lose our house. We won't be able to have the kid. I was told how my whole world would come undone. And so I didn't. But I have watched an individual go from having zero when they walked away to working at a $10 job, $10 an hour job. And within a couple of 2-3 years, turned around and ended up owning the business that they worked at because they got away from that relationship. So there is help, there's hope. But, you just have to be careful. You have to really, really safety plan.
Yeah, I'm going to dig down a little bit of a rabbit hole, and you're the perfect person to kind of go down this hole with, is in terms of mindset. Um, because in some of my business consulting, we talk a lot about change and how even in an organization, how hard change is. And I won't refer to it very long in this episode, but there was a great article on business change that used quitting smoking as an example. And what that article drove home is what I already know, is that change for the vast majority of people is hard. Even to the point where, and I've even heard this from some people, I'd rather be in this bad situation than be in this nebulous one alone and not know, what's going on. So let's talk about mindset a little bit. What, in terms of getting your mind around leaving or making that change, what needs to happen in that victim's mind?
Just when they're ready, know that, I guess the biggest thing is to provide support to people that even if they're not ready, that you're going to hear them and support them. And then when they're ready, um, like I said, making that safety plan and letting them be in control. The last thing a person needs is, I'm not going to go and tell a victim of domestic violence, this is what you should do, or this is what you have to do, because then I'm just being the controlling person.
Right.
Switch one from another. What do you need help with? How can I help you? Have you thought of these things? Would this be a problem? Like, do you have any animals that you're concerned about? Are there any important papers? Do you have any access to how to get important papers? And just help them kind of see the whole picture. Let them know that reality, it may not be perfect. It might be really difficult, and it's going to be probably pretty scary. But just I've helped victims say, look, you can always use this because their phones are being tracked, but they're required to be in my office. So I said, we can do whatever you want in this office. In fact, leave your phone. We'll leave it outside of my personal office, and we can lock it up in a file cabinet in my back, so it's here. But while you're with me, so no one can hear your conversation. And ensure them that they feel safe, and then allow them to make any phone calls or anything like that in my office.
Yeah, great advice. As we kind of begin to wrap up a little bit, and we've already kind of gone into a positive that there is hope, there are things that can be
Yeah.
done and so forth. A lot of times maybe I'm guilty of this. You think of the perpetrator and you think, okay, this it's a bad person. You see some of this on the
Yeah.
news and shows. It's like, okay, he or she, has committed, this crime or domestic violence, among, 9 people over, a 30-year period, and he or she'll never change. I'm proof that, somebody that drank heavy for 30 years is now, about to be sober for 6 years. So change can happen.
Absolutely.
And I'm not ignorant to personality disorders and so forth, and the fact that, somebody like that that's committing domestic violence probably doesn't think she or he has a problem,
No.
and that's tough to treat. However, it is treatable. So let's kind of wrap up with, if you're somebody that's a perpetrator, if you're somebody that's been accused on multiple occasions, because sometimes once is just, a bad situation. But,
Right.
if you've had, guy to guy out there, for anybody that's listening, if you've had like 6 girlfriends that have all said the same thing, that, that you have this problem, maybe you should have that sink in, and at the very least talk to a professional and say, hey, you know what? This is what I'm being told. Is that true? But for perpetrators, what's the hope of changing and actually being a quality spouse that, isn't a domestic violence perpetrator? What's kind of the journey there?
Well, the first thing is to take ownership of your
Yeah.
actions and be willing, and that's like with any long, hard, tough journey of change, is be willing to be open for feedback and to accept, your responsibility for that situation and not blame it on anybody else. And then make the changes. There's batters intervention. There's lots of long programs. Some people, I heard someone say something about a 4-week class. That is ridiculous. That is, yeah, 4 weeks is
No, don't
not.
take a class.
No, I mean, there's a batters intervention program should be anywhere between 26 weeks to 52 weeks.
Mhm.
This is a behavior that they've learned for a very long time, and it's not going to be able to be changed overnight. Also, uh, is there any mental health orders that are contributing to that behavior? Uh, because sometimes that does happen, and that needs to be addressed. They need to be open and share with their providers what their symptoms are, if there's, therapy, medication that needs to be taken to address that, and do all that hard work to get that change, just like you've done your change. It wasn't overnight, it wasn't easy. Um, but I guess I would say, speaking for you, even though I shouldn't, that you would probably say it was well worth it.
Oh, of course. Yeah,
Yeah.
and maybe this speaks to, what speaks to anything, but even somebody that is a domestic violence perpetrator, yeah, the reason that I quit alcohol was not for anybody other than myself. And frankly, there were a lot of reasons, but the number one reason was I felt like I was out of control and I
Hmm.
wanted to regain control. And I would think, fortunately, I always joke about this. I wasn't an angry, violent drunk. I was a sloppy, pass out drunk. I was just annoying. I wasn't. I didn't, the only harm I caused is, I might make a mess or fall down or or
Right?
pass out for several hours. It's just more annoying than harmful. But,
Just step
but
over Ken over there. Just don't
yeah,
worry about
yeah. It's
it.
like, he's blacked out again. But anyhow, the reason, I felt, I finally got to a point where I clearly felt I was out of control and couldn't control my own actions. And I think it's the same thing with somebody with anger issues, domestic violence, and so forth. It's like, hey, I'm doing this without thinking about stimulus and response. Yeah, I want to change, but I continue to do this activity. So therefore, it's not about controlling somebody else. It's about controlling what you're doing. And I think that maybe that is part of the key out there to getting help.
Right. It's to be able to gain that insight. And sometimes we aren't able to gain it on our own, and we have to have that external motivation, meaning like law enforcement. Maybe there's been criminal charges, and now we're involved in the criminal justice system. And so, therefore, we have that external motivator of saying, hey, look, you will do this.
Hmm.
And at that time, you might say, oh, I don't have it. But later on, it clicks. And then they're wanting to do it for themselves and not just
Hmm.
doing it because they have to. And sometimes we need that. But knowing that it's out there, um, it's just there's no easy way because we're human, and that human factor, when you factor that human piece into it, it just makes everything so much more difficult to
Yeah.
say it's this way or this way, because everything's always fluent, always changing. But there
Yeah.
is hope. It can be done. And there's, I look at now and say I'd rather be alone than be in an unhealthy relationship.
Hmm.
And everyone deserves to have a healthy relationship.
Agreed. Agreed. Diane, always great speaking with you. If I think of another great subject you're an expert on, maybe I'll get you on a third time in the same season. But
Hey,
I'm really appreciative that you were able to come back and really dig into this specific topic for a number of minutes. Diane, repeat those for those that may be victims or feel like they're victims. Repeat those numbers real quick as we kind of wrap up.
sure. Again, you can always Google, but the National Domestic Violence Hotline is that 800-799-7233. Or you can text START, START. Now you're getting me to spell 88788.
Great. I'll toss that in the show notes too. And for those folks out there, maybe they're in the greater Omaha area and need help specifically from a Diane Braun, or maybe there's some first responder conferences out there like the Law Enforcement Survival Summit where I had the pleasure of meeting you, where they need a speaker like a Diane Braun. How best can they find you out there?
All they have to do is give me a call or Google me. I got my website out, but they can call me at 402-980-7600, and I'll be glad to meet with them. I'm on LinkedIn, um, Facebook, Psychology Today as well. So
Wow, I'm impressed. Psychology Today. It's
I won't tell you how you just pay
that
a little bit of money and you get in Psychology Today.
That's better than Psychology Yesterday.
Or maybe, is it
Or
really
maybe
there? Is that psychology of visits there? Not.
Psychology 20 years ago. Yeah. I'm
Oh,
glad we've come a long way in the last 20 years. Thank the Lord.
right.
Diane, thank you so much. Always so much fun and so insightful speaking with you. Thank you for spending some time with us today.
Thanks, Ken. Take care.
My pleasure. And thank you to all of you who've either watched or listened to this episode of Public Safety Talk Radio. And we'll be back with you next week with another great guest.
Public Safety Talk Radio is produced by Bader Training and Consulting. Public Safety Talk Radio is also proud to be a part of the growing National Police Podcast Network. The National Police Podcast Network is a dedicated media network powered by the National Police Federal Credit Union, developed in partnership with experienced podcast professionals and public safety advocates. Learn more about the National Police Federal Credit Union at nationalpolicefcu.com.